For me, if you get that gut feeling, it seems like exciting, but also like, how am I going to do it? That's generally a sign to go do it. I never had a plan. It's like people tell me they write out business proposals and plans. I didn't do any of that. It all evolved organically. It was never about really making money. It was about pushing the limits of doing something that I hadn't done before. But Porsche represented, as I said, dream come true and freedom. So I just started, collecting them. But it all started from selling secondhand clothing on the boardwalk in Venice.
Hey, Magnus, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for coming over. Good to be on it.
Now, a lot of people are going to know that the name Magnus Walker is the Porsche man.
Maybe not.
Maybe they will now.
Yeah, of course.
But there was a life before Porsche.
Yes,
and
no.
It was T-shirt, apparel. That was funny enough. That's where my son knew you from.
Okay.
My point is, there's a lot about you that goes into a lot of different industries.
Yeah. And
as a pair of Brits here in downtown Los Angeles, let's start right at the beginning. How did we get Magnus out of the UK over to LA?
Well, that story started as a 19-year-old. I like to start my story born July 7th, 1967. That's pivotal, beginning, right? If I can take that liberty. Yeah, talked about the Porsche bit. When I was 10 years old, I've told this story a million times, but I think it's part of the story. When I was 10 years old, my dad took me to the London Old Court Motor Show in 1977. I came back with a program, had a poster on the wall, wrote a letter to Porsche telling them I wanted to design cars for them. Believe it or not, they wrote me a letter back. And that was, 46 years ago in 1977. But I grew up working class in Sheffield, didn't really hardly ever see Porsches. So the Porsche part of my story started as a 10-year-old, and then we'll get to it when I was 25. But I was into cars at an early age. Even though we didn't have any fancy cars in the house, my dad was a salesman. So it was a company car, Ford Granada, stuff like that, samples in the back type of thing. So the answer to your question, what got me to America, left school at 15, went on the dole for a year, 16, 17, 18, went and did this sort of bullshit Mickey Mouse, city and girls, leisure and recreation, sports management course at a community college, Stannington College in Sheffield. And that was where I heard about this thing called Camp America. I'd never heard of Camp America. I was never a Cub or a Boy Scout, never went camping. Summer camps, as you know, don't exist in England, but they exist in America. So I heard about this thing called Camp America, where essentially you come out and spend a summer in America. You spend 8 to 10 weeks on a summer camp, and then you've got anywhere between 2 to 8 weeks of travel time around. So I ended up getting placed on a summer camp for inner city, underprivileged kids north of Detroit on Lake Michigan. So took the train from Sheffield to Heathrow, got on a big bird, landed in New York City, had one night in New York City, got on a bus to the middle of nowhere, Lake Michigan, north of Detroit. I'm on the summer camp with kids. That's the long answer to how did I get to America, if that was your question.
Hey, I'm sorry for interrupting this podcast. I know it's a brilliant one, but I wanted to talk to you about your room, your connections. Now, we know full well that great things come from great connections and great rooms. Now, if you're in a room full of people that will challenge you, inspire you, motivate you, and support you, then great. But if not, then maybe I have the solution for you. Head on over to stevedsims.com, look up Sims Distillery there, and join our community of creative disruptors, those that are only not there to help you and motivate and actually give you information, but to support and answer questions. We very much vet the room to make sure that we support each other's growth. We all want each other to grow. So if you want to be in the right room, head on over to stevedsims.com/Sims Distillery, and I'll see you inside my room. Enjoy the rest of the show.
How did you end up staying?
Well, determination. The summer camp was the vehicle that got me to America. You got to remember, growing up as a kid, I watched a lot of American TV. It's Kojak, Starsky and Hutch, Dukes of Hazzard, Rockford Files. We all watched it, right? I'm listening to American music, Guns N' Roses, Motley Crue. So the goal always was not so much work on a summer camp, but I later realized that was a really informative time, and it taught me a lot of things. But the goal was get to America and get to LA. And the cheapest way to do that was work on a summer camp, which meant they paid for me to come here, gave me a little bit of pocket money. I left Sheffield, I think, with £100 in my pocket. And then I took a Trailways bus. I probably came in June, worked through the end of August, and then took a Trailways bus from Detroit to LA. That was how I got here, and landed probably a mile up the road at Union Station at 6 a.m. And, it was kind of the Union Station at 6 a.m. in 1986 wasn't like the LA that I'd seen on TV. It's like, we're all the glamorous, beautiful people. We're all the rock stars. They're not at a bus station, Greyhound, Trailways, Union Station. So I actually, my cousin had joined me from Switzerland, and we'd done the Detroit leg of the trip together. And he was going to be in America for 2 weeks, and we were going to travel around. So we ended up taking a bus from downtown LA to Hollywood, and we ended up staying in the Hollywood YMCA, just below Hollywood Boulevard between Highland and Vine for 3-4 days. And the very first day I was there, I just went out, found the local, Hollywood Boulevard was just a street full of people with broken dreams. It's like the Boulevard of Broken Dreams, misfits, crazy people, and I loved it. I found a club, sort of a goth rock metal club, and, you go there, you meet some people. This all happened really quick within like 48 hours. And then my cousin, then we went to Venice for 5 days. Then we went to San Francisco for 5 days. Then my cousin flew back to Switzerland. I came back down to LA, hooked up with the people that I've been hanging out with, and essentially didn't leave for the next 3 months. I overstayed my initial J1 student tourist visa. By that time, I'd been in the country 6 months. I was running out of money, and I decided, you know what? I'm going to have to go home to Sheffield. And that, to me, represented ultimate failure, because I'd had this 6 months of freedom of doing whatever I wanted to do without my mum telling me what time I had to come back home. And I went back to Sheffield. I remember I had to borrow money to get a one-way ticket to Heathrow. And I remember getting on the train from Heathrow to Sheffield. I've got this big duffel bags, with 6 months worth of crap that I'd collected. And I remember on the train, I couldn't even get a seat. It was so full going up to Sheffield. And I was just miserable, because I was going back to something I knew I wasn't going to be happy with, back to living with my mum and dad on the dole. So that's kind of a long, rambling answer to how I came, how I stayed for 6 months. And I went back to Sheffield that winter of 86 and really hated it. Reapplied to do Camp America the following year. And actually, I didn't get turned down, but they didn't have a position for me, because I thought, I'll be a shoe and I'll go back, and that'll be it second year around. And then literally, I remember it like it was yesterday. It was 1987. It was June. After I'd sort of been told I don't have a placement on camp, on a Tuesday, I got a phone call. They'd found a place for me. Could I leave on Saturday? Of course, I'm on the dole, don't have a job. Sure, I can leave on Saturday. I think I left with £200 this time. Same thing, except this time it was even better. Still an underprivileged inner city camp. It's sort of like the wealthy camp, and then the not wealthy camp, normally funded by some Salvation Army or St. Vincent de Paul's sort of church or something. And the second one was a camp outside of Newark. But the greatest thing about the second one was Newark's only like 35, 40 minutes from Manhattan. So the kids had come for like 10, 12 days, and you'd have 2 days off. I started exploring New York as a 20-year-old in 1986, worked that summer. And then this time around, I ended up saving a bit more money, because I got a job as a lifeguard on the back end of this summer camp experience. So I bought a one-way ticket, like Frontier Airlines or something, and you could fly pretty cheap then. It'd be like, I don't think the ticket was even $100 from New York to LA. Of course, I'd kept in touch with these rock and roll friends from the year before, but this was all writing letters. No cell phone, email didn't exist. Life was simple. And I arrived in LA like early September of 1987. And I remember somehow getting into an MTV party. And it was just like this rock and roll lifestyle that just was great for the next decade or so. So that was how I ended up going from Sheffield to LA as a 19, 20-year-old.
So you knew LA was the place that you had to be. That was the focus. You'd got here once, you'd gone back. You knew you had to come back. What did you do then to realize you needed to stay? How did you monetize being here?
Well, you got to remember, it's 1987. A little goes a long way. Being English and a 20-year-old was a novelty. So that kind of meant you didn't really pay for much. You get to bars, you get to clubs early, you get in free, you meet the bartenders, you drink for free, or it's happy hour. You're living on 25-cent frozen burritos. A little bit went a long way. You couch surfing, so you're not paying rent. You don't have any adult responsibilities at this point. There's no insurance on a car because you don't own a car. I didn't have an apartment. So you're living on borrowed time and favors of living on friends' floors and things like that. So I kind of did what I call the sex, drugs, rock and roll tour for probably, I don't know, 18 months, going out 3-4 nights a week. And it was great. People are just, I was like a new face on the scene, I suppose. And it was all rock and roll. Everything I was into was happening here. It was clubs like the Cat House. It was just a real energized moment to be alive in the sort of late 80s. Everything that I was into music-wise was LA. And that novelty probably lasted till 89. It was almost probably 18 months. And then the novelty of like 25-cent burritos and scrounging for change and literally not having anything to occupy your time during the day. Obviously, I'm out till 2, 3, 4 in the morning, sleeping until noon. But you still got to occupy your time where the person you're staying with actually has a job. So you're hanging out on your own, riding a bus, or I think I bought a cheap bicycle for like $20 and I'm cycling around. Or I was always sort of codependent on other people to get me from A to B, to live on their floor. So that novelty sort of started wearing off. And it was a little bit like, well, I don't want to have to go back to Sheffield again because I've tasted that defeat and that defeat didn't taste good. So ironically, I just stumbled accidentally into a part-time job on the boardwalk in Venice. I was walking, and you got to remember the boardwalk in Venice in the late 80s was Mecca. It was this artisan, hippie, crystal, tarot card reader, cheap sunglasses, cheap T-shirts, entertainers, vaudeville. And it's been like that forever. Charlie Chaplin sort of got his start on the boardwalk 100 years ago. And it's this whole, like the British seaside town, right? You name it, whether it's Blackpool or whatever, Skegness, Scarborough, whatever it is, right? Venice is kind of that, except the sun shines and it's not cold. So I remember walking down the boardwalk. I was probably looking pretty flamboyant. And this guy says to me, "Hey, are you English?" And I went, "Yeah." And struck up a conversation. He said, "Do you want a job?" I go, "Doing what?" And he goes, "Hawking." I go, "Yeah, I can do that." Because my background is my mum's side of my family, the Edwards, were market traders. So they sold everything from cutlery to pots and pans to paintbrushes down in the market. And they'd do county fairs and shows. So I was the guy that was like, "Step right up, come on in. 1 for 5, 2 for 10, 4 for 15. I'm the person getting the crowd into this booth, which was actually selling seconds from the Gap. So it's T-shirts and stuff like that. I wasn't interested in that, but it was a job. It was £10 a day. It was a job just on the weekends. So it's only $20 a weekend, but it was something. And it was something that got me out of bed. And it was something that motivated me. And it opened the door to the next step. And what the door had opened up to was this entrepreneurial spirit, this market trader spirit. And I happened to see there was an old hippie selling some secondhand clothing. I'd always been into secondhand clothing. And by that, I mean Levi's and motorcycle boots and leather jackets and stuff like that. I go, "Oh, this looks pretty interesting." And I'd always go to yard sales and thrift stores and buy stuff. So during the weekend, I'd work selling the seconds from the Gap. And then during the week, I'd go to yard sales and just buy things. Like you could buy Levi's for 50 cents, started putting patches on them, sold them for $10, $15, $20. So that was how I sort of accidentally got into the clothing business.
But you took it further.
Yeah, that was the first step. So the first step was I could always sew. For me, the simple answer is I just made what I personally liked to wear. My mom had taught me how to sew as a kid, which was basically making my jeans tight and sewing AC/DC and rainbow and Motorhead patches on my denim jacket. But that skill came in handy. I started dating this girl. She had a sewing machine. And we started, I guess, what you would call now upcycling clothing. We'd buy old recycled clothing, cut up old paisley dresses and shirts and things, and sew patches on these jeans. And it was kind of a combination of, call it Grateful Dead meets the Black Crowes rock and roll. And then this thing happened. It's all about timing. The rave culture. Remember the rave scene, late 80s, early 90s? They're all into psychedelic stuff and trippy things. And, I kind of fell into the rave culture. By that, I mean, I was making these little reversible hats like Guatemalan tams, but I was doing it with velvet fabric. And I remember someone came up to me who was going to a rave and said, "Can you make a Cat in the Hat hat?" I didn't even know what a Cat in the Hat was, but I quickly learned and I quickly figured out how I could make one. It's a couple of long strips in a round circle and your 2 different colors, red and white, sew them together. And the first one wasn't great. The second wasn't great, but the third, fourth one was pretty good. And no one was doing what I was doing at the time. So I hit this sort of pinnacle of timing where the rave culture happened And then I'd always been into Americana. I touched on it earlier. Captain America, Evel Knievel, red, white, and blue, stars and stripes. So I started putting like stars and stripes patches. I buy these old sort of printed up fabrics and sew them on. And then the Gulf War happened in 1990. Everyone was patriotic American fever. And I've been doing these Uncle Sam top hats. For me at the time, it was just colorful stuff. But the rave scene hit. Then this whole patriotic Gulf War thing hit where people were buying these Levi's because it was Americana with like stars and stripes on them and the hats and things like that. And then, so I'd sort of gone from selling 5 pieces to 10 to 50 to 100, gone from making them myself to realizing I can't make them quick enough. So we actually hired people who would help put patches on the jeans. Then we found a sewing contractor that could sew the hats. Then someone said to us, you should think about wholesaling these. We go, wholesale? What is that? So end up putting like 100 items in a bag, went down Melrose where the trendy stores were, and just walked in and said, hey, can I see the buyer? We're making these hats. And no one was doing it at the time. And I think the first one we sold 12, then 24. So it built like that. And then someone said, you should do a trade show. What's a trade show? Before you know it, we're on a plane to New York. This is like 1990, 91 with the jeans and the hats. And I remember the very first trade show we ever did, we got an order from Disneyland for the theme parks. And they bought 12 styles. We only had 12 styles. And they bought 144 of each one. And we couldn't even make that many. But what we were doing was something just a little bit different. We were making the hats reversible. They were whimsical. They were based on characters. Uncle Sam, Court Jester, very sort of Lewis Carroll inspired. And it was just the timing of all these 3 things hit at the same time to where all of a sudden we rented a garage in Venice where we were doing production. Then we outgrew that. We rented a warehouse in Venice, eventually outgrew that, and then started wholesaling. 5 stores becomes 10, 10 becomes 20, 20 becomes 50. And then we just had a great run for a couple of years with the hats and patchwork jeans. And that was sort of how I took it that next step. But it all started from selling secondhand clothing on the boardwalk in Venice.
Would you say that you were entrepreneurial?
Yeah, for sure. I talk all the time about, I see people as 2 things. Book smart, that's my sister. She ended up with, 12 O levels, 5 A levels, went to Durham University, got a degree. I'm the opposite. The guy left school at 15 with 2 O levels. So I'm entrepreneurial street smart. I didn't realize that when I was in Sheffield, England, because there was no opportunity to find something you love to do that you're passionate about that motivated me to put 10, 12, 14 hours a day learning a craft that I had no experience in. Like, I always liked to wear sort of rock and roll, heavy metal clothing, which was a fashion statement. But it wasn't like I went to fashion school like people do to learn how to become a fashion designer. And having looked back on the past 36 years of my life in LA, all my adult responsibility of everything I talked about, getting my own apartment, having my own job, my own car, before you know it, I've got a bank account, a social security number, I'm paying tax. But I'm actually illegal here at this point, and I was up until 2000 when I got a green card. But that didn't matter. I'd found something that I loved doing, back to entrepreneurial spirit. The 3 things that I've done in that whole period of time are basically clothing that we're talking about, property investment that we're sat in, and sort of modifying cars. And all 3 of them are things that I have no experience in, but they're the fabric, they're the thread to my fabric. And that fabric really is just being passionate about things I'm motivated about, that I'm interested in it, that you can spend all this time perfecting the craft of what I call a hobby, meaning you can do something all day long without getting paid for it, without making money for it to begin with, right? It was never about really making money. It was about pushing the limits of doing something that I hadn't done before. I remember making this Evel Knievel inspired motorcycle jacket with stars and stripes on it. And I just found something that I liked, took it apart, traced the pattern, cut it out of new fabric, sewed it back together. Trial and error. When serious clothing was pretty popular, sort of in the 90s, we'd do these trade shows and everyone would come up. They're either buyers buying for the store, or it's fashion students, who are thinking of going to college to learn how do I get into the fashion business. And I remember having some conversations with some people that were thinking of going to FITM in New York. What did I think about going to fashion school? I go, well, it's probably, it could be good, but it's never going to teach you the idea. It'll teach you the concept of marketing and how to run a business and all that stuff. But I'm a big believer in the idea cannot be taught. You either have it or you don't. It either comes from within. You can open your eyes, gain inspiration, and look around, but then you're following the fashion. You're following the trend. You're not setting it. We were always doing things that motivated myself to get out of bed. I designed the clothes I personally like to wear that were slightly different from what other people were doing at the same time, in the sense of I was using different fabrics that weren't necessarily the norm for clothing. An example would be car seat fabric. We'd found this cheap car seat fabric, which we made a whole line of sort of semi-futuristic clothing out of. We'd take drapery upholstery fabric, which is a bit of a crossover, but, we were doing items of clothing that other people weren't doing in that time. And it was a cycle, right? I'm pulling reference from the 60s and 70s, the glory years of what I was into, whether it's motorsport or whether it's fashion. It's the 60s and 70s. I'm not interested in doo-wop from the 50s, so I'm not making suits and looking like Buddy Holly, but I'm taking inspiration from Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones and Black Sabbath. And I think later on I realized that as a kid, I was into heavy metal music. Growing up in Sheffield, I saw a lot of these bands, Saxon, Motorhead, you name it, they came through the Sheffield City Hall. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is I was never a team sport player. I was a cross-country middle distance runner. I didn't play for the football team, so I later realized that my path was like this lone wolf, came to America on my own. I'm still hanging out on my own. I'm alone, but not lonely. I don't have this team behind me. There's no one here, agents, managers. When I drive alone. And the heavy metal music was kind of like, I realized it was building this rebellious spirit, which obviously I had inside myself, but didn't realize at the time. And all these ingredients have just sort of been thrown into the mix, the melting pot, the stew, the flavor of what I am that's percolated over time. And that happened here in LA. I don't think it would have happened if I'd stayed in Sheffield. The opportunity's not there. Like the opportunity in LA, you can be whatever you want to be, right? You can, brew bourbon, movie star, actor, rock star, skateboard designer, whatever it is. There's an infrastructure and an industry that is here to support that if you are prepared to put the effort in. That might not be the same if I'd stayed in Sheffield. Like we bought this building. So the clothing company got pretty successful, enabled me to buy my own building instead of renting a loft in a warehouse. People thought we were crazy when we bought this building in this area that's called the Arts District in downtown LA. But we didn't ask people's opinions and we didn't seek their advice out because a lot of them were saying, why are you doing that? It's not a good idea. If we'd never bought this building, we'd have never fallen into the film location business, which was the next opportunity to do something that was super enjoyable, which we had no background in, but was pretty lucrative. And that enabled me to have more cars than I ever thought I would have, all housed under one roof. And then to top it off, the icing on the cake, the value of the building's probably gone up at least 10 times what we paid for it 20 years ago. Because what was once a desolate former industrial warehouse light manufacturing area is now the epicenter of Spotify's 200 yards away. We got Soho House with a hotel 2 blocks away. We got Warner Brothers Publishing that relocated from Burbank 2 blocks away, 1 block away, actually. And then on the corner of my street, 100 yards from where we sat, there's 2 coffee shops and a restaurant and a bar and a gallery and all this stuff. So timing, right? I talked about, in the 90s, falling into this clothing, something that I enjoyed doing. Then this culture moved in, this movement of which I was sort of at the epicenter of. And then buying property in a underdeveloped neighborhood, which got gentrified and transformed. I've lived in this neighborhood since 1994. I've been here almost 30 years. I've owned property for 23 years. So I live, work, and invest in the area where I'm in. So I'm kind of centralized in what I do. I've got this small footprint of things that motivate me that I'm talking about, the cars, the property, the fashion, the buildings. I like projects. Humans like to collect, whether it's guitars, cars, stamps, watches, whatever it may be, right? And I like projects, whether it's restoring old cars or old houses or modifying things. So they were all able to be done in this one space, which actually made me pretty efficient because I never commuted to work. These people that commute to work and waste an hour going each way, do the math, 10 hours a week, 40 hours a month. I'm walking to work. So I'm efficient.
I think I want to challenge one of the elements that you're saying. You constantly mentioned opportunity, and you constantly mentioned timing. Entrepreneurs see things differently. You know, we're almost in the matrix. We recognize opportunities. We may not be able to go, oh, there's an opportunity, but something in us goes, hey, maybe I can latch onto that, and we move into that. Everything you've spoken about, you've gone, oh, the timing was right. I think it was purely because you saw things and read things a bit differently. Now, you saw the apparel, you saw real estate, and you're right. And we've come down here, me and my son and my family have come down the downtown Los Angeles area, where if we had come down here 5 or 6 years ago, we'd have been spending $500,000 on stuff. You're coming down here now, and we saw an apartment the other day. They wanted $2.5 million for the same place, and it'd been split up into 3 different apartments. So you saw the opportunity and you jumped into it. I think the real difference is that you took action. Yeah. And a lot of people don't take action.
This is a talking point. A lot of people are afraid of failure, so they don't cross the start line.
That's where
because to get sight, ultimately they don't have the inner confidence, so they second guess themselves. And then generally they'll ask their buddy, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think? For whatever reason, half the time they're going to hear no. I don't think that's a good idea. So that they fail before they fail because they don't begin, they don't start.
Yeah,
they're afraid to cross over that line. For me, if you get that gut feeling, it seems like exciting, but also like, how am I going to do it? That's generally a sign to go do it. I don't second guess. I don't ask other people's opinions. It's just something that feels right. Like this building was a perfect example. This was the first thing we ever bought. At the time, it seemed a lot of money, even though it's gone up at least 10 times what we paid for it. At the time, it still seemed a lot of money. But we had money to put down. We took an SBA loan. So it wasn't even a calculated risk. It was just something that felt right at the time. That was it. We didn't really think much more of it. A little bit later on, I saw this crystal ball. Ironically, one of the things that put me on the map was Tamir Moscovici's film Urban Outlaw. It's a story about my journey, came out 11 years ago in 2012. And it was filmed, and there were some scenes where I'm talking on the roof about how I envisioned the neighborhood coming. And this is 10 years ago, so I've been here 20 years. And fast forward, the crystal ball is kind of falling into place about what I was talking about 10 years ago. It just takes time for that thing to evolve. But I suppose you're right in the sense of it may not feel like opportunity. It may just feel like something you really are passionate about doing. Like we didn't just buy one building, we ended up buying 6 buildings. You know, we bought a bunch of land under a bridge that no one ever knew anyone owned, you know, it's because there's a bridge built on it, but the city didn't own the land. It was owned by a railroad company based in Texas. And I'd just come back from London, and I'd seen everything that had been happening by the Tate Modern and, you know, the South Embankment, where the typical London, all these railway arches disused, right? Someone's turning them into everything from car parks to taxi cab stands to, on the high end, restaurants and nightclubs, right?
Yeah.
And I go, wow, I could do that right there under the bridge. So, you know, it was thinking out of the box, you know, not looking for something that had a for sale sign on it, but just thinking, wow, this land is underutilized. How do I acquire this land? You know, there's no sale sign on it. There was no parcel number on it. Couldn't pull a record on it. But it turned out there's a lot of land like that that's owned by railroad companies who had land rights all over the country that then cities had easements to build bridges on, but they never owned the land. So the land was available right in the middle of what's become highly desirable. Diamond in the rough thing, right? I'm always sort of searching out the not obvious opportunity. It's like the 25-cent Levi's that I'm putting $1 worth of cut up shirts on and a little bit of my time. And then it becomes a $10 item, a $20 item, a $25 item. Cars, I'm buying them when they're $5 cars, and then they double and triple and double again, and then they're worth $50, right? People go, how do you have so many cars? Well, I bought them when they were just an old car. Might have been an old Beetle. It's an old Porsche, but they weren't that different. You know, they were affordable. You know, it's kind of changed now, but the first one I bought 30 years ago, they were affordable. So, you know, I just acquired things that I was into, that I wanted to own, that I wanted to experience. And that was it. There was no master plan of, you know, I remember at school before I left at 15, you go see a careers officer. Where do you see yourself in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? I had no idea. I still don't really know. The older I get, the more I'm now thinking about, well, okay, I could see myself being 70, and that's only 14 years down the road type of thing, right? So now I'm thinking a little further forward, but the whole way do you see yourself, what's this plan? I never had a plan. It's like people tell me they write out business proposals and plans. I didn't do any of that. It all evolved organically, and it took a long time to get to these levels of, I suppose, success. But Serious Clothing was pretty successful and able to start by this building. This building got us into the film location business. That enabled us to buy other things, other buildings. Building went up in value. We pulled equity out, refinanced, bought other things, right? So you end up getting on this cycle. But then you get to a point like I turned 56 years ago. My life changed. I've been on the high, and then I had a very low. And then priorities shift, and you go, I got all this stuff around, right? And it's not quite as meaningful as it once was. So now I'm starting to think, well, I got a lot of cars that I don't necessarily drive because I'm traveling all the time, or I've built things that, they scratch that itch of achieving a personal goal of doing something, building a car a certain way. But then when you've done it, it might not be quite as significant as the journey and the process was to acquire it, to build it, to develop it, to drive it, and then the community around it. So, for me, priorities are shifting a little bit. I closed down my Serious Clothing company 11 years ago, and that opened the door of what I called freedom. The ultimate freedom for me was being able to do whatever you wanted to do when you want to do it. And I'd done this Serious Clothing from the early 90s, had some success that I've talked about. But the past couple of years of it, I was at a different point in my life. I wasn't at the point where I was going out 2-3 nights a week. So I'd sort of disconnected from the scene that I was in, meaning I wasn't caring about wearing flash clothes. And so, of course, sales had dwindled because we'd essentially taken our eye off the ball. We'd lost the passion for fashion, in a sense. But we closed that door down, not knowing what was going to happen next, but knowing that the film location revenue from the rental of the location was paying the mortgage. And then what happened next was that film Urban Outlaw, which opened the door to me traveling all over the world for the past 10 years, doing some great stuff and meeting some great people. If I had a day job of running a clothing company with a dozen people working 10, 12 hours a day, I would not have had that freedom to travel the world. So now I'm at the point where I call myself almost semi-retired, and I'm just trying to stay motivated and creative, doing little projects that keep me busy and excite me and get me out of bed at 5 a.m. to go film a car type of thing. So, I've always been into cars. I've always sort of been motivated just to make the most out of time, right? These, memorable moments, I call them, and time's precious and it does go quick. I've seen life being taken away in an instant like that, and you go, okay, that's a bit of game changer, because now you think about, you got to make the most out of every moment, live for the day, not do, I'll put it off tomorrow, right? I try and avoid putting things off tomorrow. I say yes more than I say no to things that, first of all, are interesting to me. So the power of saying yes just opens the door to a possibility of a conversation that you may never know where it ends up. I've been fortunate enough to do some collaborations like with Nike and Hot Wheels and various other things that just happen purely organically from a conversation. Someone comes down, can I come and visit you? Yes. Because you don't know where that opportunity is going to go, right? And so
is that an age thing?
No, I think I've always been tried to be generous with my time, because coming up, obviously people help me, sleeping on the couch, driving you around, everything I've described. So in a way, it's kind of like giving back. I'm always people are always welcome to come here. I'm not always here, but I have time on my hands. So I don't think it's an age thing. I think it's just maximizing time and sharing experiences, what I think it is.
I want to get into what created you to become the Porsche legend that you are. But before we get into that, anyone watching this podcast, anyone listening to it, they're going to go, well, he was lucky there. He hit the time in there. He had the energy here. He had the motivation here. It's very easy when you're in your 50s to go, oh, yeah, this was good. This was good. This was good. But you also said, and you mentioned one bit about you had a serious low. You make growth from when things don't always go to plan.
Right.
There's got to have been some moments in your life, whether it be the real estate, the contracts, the conversations, the clothing line. Things didn't go to plan. You want to give us some of those dark moments?
Sure, yeah. I mean, if you don't always have a plan, it's just a deviation in the road. It's a hurdle you got to jump over. It's something you've got to overcome, whether you produced an order that arrived late and you stuck with 1,000 pieces because Hot Topic bounced it back or it didn't fit right. But, I find, I've had the highs of a lot of money in the bank and I've had the lows of no money in the bank. How am I going to pay the mortgage? And I find I'm way more creative when I've got less comfort. Yeah. Like when there's no money in the bank. When it came to designing clothing, we'd do 3 main trade shows a year. And we always knew, okay, there's one in January, one in June, one in September. And most people plan ahead, 3 months ahead. They got a mood board on the wall with all the swatches and stuff like that. I wasn't that organized, but 2-3 weeks out, I got highly motivated. And that was when all my sort of creative juices were really flowing. There's been times when, like I said, I've had no money in the bank. And that's when you get really creative and decide, okay, I've got some assets here that I can unload. And that just really motivates you to do this, what I call sink and swim. And this comes back to the summer camp when I was a 19-year-old on Lake Michigan, north of Detroit. And I'm into Guns N' Roses, Motley Crue, and I'm looking like I'm in the band. And everyone else on the summer camp is into Run DMC and LL Cool J. So it's a culture clash. I wasn't comfortable in that environment because I was out of sort of my comfort zone. Hence, I became what I call an adaptive swimmer. This is a term I use, an adaptive swimmer. And by that, I mean, you got to learn to swim or you're going to drown, right? So you get thrown in a pool, sink or swim. So I quickly learned to be able to sort of communicate with other people, I think, relatively well. And I'm all about communication. It's my big thing. It's like in this day and age where everyone's connected via phone and someone says to you, oh, I was out of town, I couldn't get back to you. I'm like, unless you're on Mars, you've got cell phone reception. Yeah. You can get back to me. So communication is always a big key for me. And, that's just one thing that I always try to communicate. But the highs and the lows is, I mean, my wife, who I'd been with for over 20 years, died in 2015. It was the lowest point in my life. I'm like, fuck, how am I ever going to bounce back from this low, low, low? Right. And everyone adjusts differently to that big loss. And we were partners. Everything I talked about, we built it together. We dodged a few bullets over the years without going into the details. And then that all changed in 2015. I'm like, my life's over at this point, And then I kind of roamed for, I don't know, a year, traveled and was sort of disconnected. And that was how I was dealing with this loss of, there's no guidebook to how you come back from that, right? But little by little you do if you stay motivated, set these baby step goals of achievable things. It wasn't like I'd gone down this path of drugs and alcohol and all that thing. So it was a low point, but from that, I gradually came back from it and then met a new person and a new chapter opened up. But I had to travel to deal with that loss. And I still think in a way I'm dealing with that loss because there was someone that I built everything together with who's now not here. So, that's one of those things that's always going to be there. But I just kind of dealt with it the best I could. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I like the way that you say that if a problem arises, it's actually just a deviation. It's a hurdle. And so for you to continue your journey, get over that hurdle.
Yeah.
So you started off as the kid. You gave us the kiddie story of when you saw that Porsche.
Yeah.
And you wrote the letter and they wrote back.
Right.
Now you're making money. You've got the fashion brand. You're actually moving out. You've got the properties. Now you're in a position to be able to get involved in the Porsche world because, hey, as a kid, you loved that. What took you from going, hey, I'm going to buy a Porsche to actually being a fundamental cornerstone of Porsche world?
Well, I don't know if I am. I mean, the first one I bought, I was 25 and I bought it at the Pomona Swap Meet in 1992. So that's 31 years ago. I spent $7,500 on it. And that was kind of a lot of money for me back then. And it was the third car I'd ever bought. I never had a car in England. First car I bought was a 1977 Toyota Corolla, $200. Drove it around illegally in LA, took my driver's test in that in 1988. Second car I bought was probably early 91, was a Saab 900 Turbo. And that was when I had a little bit of disposable income. But the one that made all the difference was the first Porsche I bought, the third car I ever bought, that $7,500 slant-nose 911 conversion. That represented this dream come true of 15 years earlier, wrote the letter to Porsche, had the poster on the wall. It was a dream come true. And more importantly, though, it was a sense of personal achievement that I had actually achieved on my own. You know, it wasn't like I borrowed money from family and bought a car. I didn't grow up with that way of life. So that really was like, wow, you know, this solidified by that point. I'd been in LA 5 years, you know, and I'm doing everything I'm talking about, you know, got a business, paying taxes, ironically, employing American people, but I was technically illegal because I'd overstayed my visa. So I never left the country for 13 years, actually 14 years, until 2001 when my sister got married just after, like in October of 2001. So I didn't really worry too much about certain things. Back to this outlaw spirit. I'm just doing my thing. But Porsche represented, as I said, dream come true and freedom. And then I didn't get my second one till probably 1999. That's the car that became 277 that's here. So in the 90s, you know, I'm building the business, serious clothing. Things are firing full cylinders. I had other cars at the time. I had a Super B, I had an E-Type Jag, I had a 73 Lotus Europa. But little by little, and a few other Porsches, but little by little, I got rid of the non-Porsche cars. Because all those cars kind of did one thing well, like the E-Type looked good, but didn't really drive good. Super B was fast, but didn't stop, didn't handle. But the Porsche kind of did everything really pretty well. And back then, you got to remember 20, 30 years ago, these were $5,000 cars. They were affordable. So I just started, you know, collecting them. And then I joined the Porsche Owners Club, which is where I say I took my, call it spirited street driving to the racetrack in 2002. Over the next 5-6 years, up to like 2008, did 40, 50 track days a year, became a better driver, spent a lot of money racing, got some $5 plaques that are gathering dust on the wall in my office, and then realized the more competitive. It's funny, if you look at that thing over there, just grab that program next to the skull. See the top one?
This thing?
No, it says Porsche Owners Club.
Oh, yeah.
Grab that.
Yep.
So ironically, I was looking for something the other day. This is from 2004. Look at the front of it.
Okay.
2004. And there's a post-it there. Open that post-it. And this wasn't planned knowing you were coming. I was looking for something else and stumbled into it. Look at that geezer there. Baby beard from 2004 when I was short track champion. So back to set a goal, achieve a goal. I went to the race, took my spirited street driving to the racetrack. It had some success. But the more competitive I became, the less fun it actually became for me. You know, these events became 3-4 day events. You start stressing out about them, kind of suck the fun out of them a little bit. Because I didn't have a team behind me, back to that lone wolf. You know, parts of it were great and parts of it weren't great. And so probably around 2008, all that money that I'd spent doing everything I just talked about, I said, let me try my hand at building my interpretation of my dream sport purpose streetable track car 911. You know, so I added elements of Americana, hot rod, and the thing that really separated me and still does from a lot of other people that build similar cars is, one, for the most part, it's a business for a lot of people. They're building customer cars. This is a hobby. I don't build customer cars. But I never look to reinterpret or duplicate something exactly the way it came from the factory. Example would be, you know, Martini Turbo or something in a Gulf livery. You know, I'd add elements of Americana into it and throw it in this blender, and what would come out would be a little bit of hot rod, a little bit of sport purpose, a little bit of Vic Elford, Monte Carlo Rally, Le Mans, these glory days back to the 60s and 70s in inspiration. And because I'm just building for myself, there's no deadline. You know, I'm not building for a customer, managing their expectations on timeline and deliverables or whatever it may be. Having run a business, I don't want my hobby to be a business. Therefore, you know, I've never gone down that road of building customer cars. And I think what's happened there is through Tamir's film, which came out in 2012, Urban Outlaw, that opened the door to this thing I did called the TED Talk 2014. 2015, I get in the Need for Speed video game. 2016, I start doing stuff with Hot Wheels. 2017, I have a book come out. So my relatability through these various other mediums, whether it's a TED Talk, where that's the most watched thing I've done with almost 10 million views on that TED Talk. I would say 98% of the people that watched it had no idea who I was and are not car people, but they're relating to the story of everything we've been talking about, which was wrapped up in an 18-minute TED Talk called Go With Your Gut Feeling. Keep it simple. If it feels right, do it. That's the TED Talk message. So I think my audience grew beyond the Porsche-centric world. You get in a game like Need for Speed with Ken Block, and it's all different genres of car people Fast and Furious, drift, street racing, whatever it is. And I think the true relatability of all genuine car people is it doesn't really matter what you drive. This is my poison Porsche. It's my drug of choice. But it could have been a Subaru, could have been something else. And I think true gearheads, motorheads, whatever you want to call them, they relate to the thrill of the first is the chase, whether it's a car you had or you grew up with or your neighbor had or you took your first ride in it or your first girlfriend in it. You start chasing that car for whatever reason. So it's the thrill of the chase. You're looking online, recycler, whatever it may be, Craigslist, eBay, whatever, bring a trailer. Then it's like you acquire the car, you got to build the car. Then it's the first drive or race. And then it's the community that's around it. So yeah, I'm known as that Porsche guy because I've owned a lot of them. And when Tamir's film came out, there wasn't a lot of cinematic filmmaking of that quality at that time done that way. And then back to timing, his film came out October 15th, 2012, 2013. It's the whole 50th anniversary of the Porsche 911 brewing. So I became the go-to story person for things that were not the typical Porsche norm, meaning I didn't look like the stereotypical Porsche person, which back then there sort of was one. Generally an older, wealthier, mostly male doctor, lawyer, or someone that's on the... Yeah, he's got the golf shorts on, he's got his polo shirt on, he's playing golf, he's a member of the PCA region Zone 8, and he's called Bob Smith, and he's got his badge on it, right? And he's going to go, that's the wrong shade of cat plate, and I go, I don't care. My car, I can do whatever I want with it, right? So I became that guy that didn't quite fit the norm, was building and designing cars that were obviously familiar silhouettes, but the story evolved a little bit more. And the fact that it wasn't a business, so I wasn't promoting anything, and it wasn't just nailed into... A lot of people, when they think of Porsche, they think of air-cooled 911. And yeah, that's a big, big part of it. And I've owned a lot of them, and I still do. But I'm a goal-orientated collector when it comes to this mark called Porsche, which is why you see cars with the engine in the front, cars with the engine in the middle, and cars with the engine in the back, front, mid, rear-engined, air and water-cooled. I'm all about variety. So that just expanded this base further on. And then, I had the opportunity to drive other people's cars and travel around the world and attend events. But none of that was planned. And it's back to relatability. It's me and an iPhone. There's not an agent, a manager you have to go through to get to me, to book me. And, I do everything, I just go places. I'm not charging appearance fees or any of that stuff. It's just more fuel for the fire, doing more cool shit with cool people. That's it.
I have noticed that there is a trend through this. You move with your gut, as you've already mentioned, and the TED Talk that we'll actually put in the bottom of the show notes of this. But you don't know, and you're unqualified in most of the stuff that you've got involved in.
Correct.
And you haven't allowed that to hold you back. In fact, you've used it
as an advantage.
Correct. You haven't actually had all of the mistakes that people go to school to learn, and all the parameters and all the color in the lines. You've gone, hey, I like that. Let me have a play.
I don't have lines that I have to color in.
Yeah.
If you don't have parameters, you're not boxed in. Therefore, you can go wherever you want. I'm not boxed in to stay between the lines. That's kind of a metaphor where I'm at. I'm not staying between lines. Therefore, if you're not following the rules, you're not really breaking the rules, right? The rules of wrong shade of CAD plate or has to be a certain way because you're doing it for someone else. You're doing it for yourself. You're kind of making your own rules up. Back to that sort of outlaw spirit. I didn't pick the name Urban Outlaw that was given to the film. It was an article on a Total 911 magazine about me building what was known as outlaw-style cars, living in an urban environment. You look at outlaw in the dictionary, it's someone that lives beyond the rules of the law, right? Outlaw Josie Wales. So back to this rebellious teenager, heavy metal, loneliness of the long-distance runner, not being in a team. This thing was building from when I was a kid in Sheffield. And what was there was the fire and drive and British bulldog spirit that the tenaciousness to figure out a way to get something you want, whether you got to beg, steal, or borrow. Well, if we had more time, I'd tell you all these sort of deals where you just find a way to get stuff done, to acquire it, right? There's a lot of patience involved, especially when it comes to cars. Someone's thinking of selling it, but once they say yes, I'm paying them like as soon as I hang up the phone. There's no second guessing. There's no borrowing money. I'm going to work a deal and then I'm going to execute that deal. I'm not sending out I've owned over 100 cars. I did a pre-purchase inspection once, and that was only because the car was in Australia. So I'm going with the gut. When it comes to cars, imagine the worst, hope for the best. That's the moral I live by. And whatever I've bought at whatever price point, whether it's low or high, there's always been something wrong with the car. So nothing ever has to be perfect for me. So I'm not sort of that disappointed when things aren't quite what they seem to be, because I haven't set it up where it needs to be perfect. Nothing needs to be perfect for me. Nothing is perfect. So it kind of, I try not to box myself into these boundaries that are predetermined by, oh, you don't have education, or you can't possibly do that. You're not educated in that field, right? That's kind of a bit of that British mentality, which is why I had to get out of there. My scorecard is not looking great, having left school at 15 with 2 O-levels, being from the north. This is not like saying you are going to achieve stuff. But here's something I always come back to. Did I ever tell you about my Sebastian Coe certificate thing?
No.
So as a young kid, and I'm talking 8, 9, 10, probably 9 through 14, I was a pretty good cross-country runner, middle distance run. And in my book, I've actually got a copy of it because I've somehow, miraculously, my mum never managed to throw away a bunch of stuff that meant something to me as a kid. So here's the teachable Sebastian Coe. In 1978, when I was 11 years old, I was doing a lot of cross-country running. I later ended up becoming the British schoolboys cross-country champion. But when I was 10, 11, I hadn't quite achieved that status. But I was getting on what I would call the podium, first, second place. And I've got this certificate. It's a Sheffield running thing. And I finished second or third. I didn't win it. But I met Sebastian Coe. And Sebastian Coe ran for this club called the Hallamshire Harriers. I also ran for the Hallamshire Harriers. And in 1980, Sebastian Coe would go on to be Olympic champion, world record holder. But I met him a couple of years before that. But he was a rising, shining star. And so I had clippings out of the Sheffield Star on my wall. And he was kind of like a hero figure of mine that motivated me. Anyway, he signed this certificate, and all he said was, "Well done, Sebastian Coe." And I'm talking about it 45 years later, because it was a stop and chat, shake hand, well done. But I'm still talking about it because a little bit of motivation goes a long, long way. So this is back to, you were talking about earlier about time, and it's a way of giving back. Like, he gave his time. He said, well done. I didn't necessarily get a pat on the back and well done from my dad too often, especially when I got into heavy metal and started drinking and dropped out of school, and the rest you know. So there was a little bit of headbutt there. But Sebastian Coe, someone who was, I would call, a hero of mine as a young kid, I met him and he said, well done. That was it.
Gave a nudge.
I still have that certificate 45 years later.
And that story.
And he's now Sir Sebastian Coe. And this is a teachable element of a little goes a long way. So that's why I try to give back. That's why when a lot of people come up to me, not always at the best time at car meets, when you're either coming or going, you're hungry or whatever, right? Your dog's doing something. You got to be the nice guy, because it's like supporting what I'm doing in a way which inspires me. Like when I do these events, right, and I'll do these outlaw gatherings or signings or book giveaways or whatever it is, and someone will go, we only need you for half an hour. But I go, well, the line's still there an hour later. They come back 90 minutes later, line's still there, and you can go if you want. I go, well, I don't want to be that guy that someone waited at the back of the line, right, for 2 hours and then I just walked away. So in that situation, I'm the first in, last out. Because to me, it's time. I've got time. Time's free, right? I'm not charging people for time, So I always remember the Sebastian Coe bit, and people say this all the time. You sort of got to give back, and that's something that I think keeps me grounded. I really think it does that, and getting a lot of steps in every day.
As we wind down the podcast, you've tried many different things. Each one of them you've moved and originated from your gut. If it doesn't excite interest, you're not doing it. And then you found a way to make it work. You needed to go to LA, find a way to make it work. I want to get into clothing, find a way to make it work. Everything you found, you've had an idea, and then you've worked out how to get it in. And any way that it hasn't worked out right, there's been an education along the way. There's been that hurdle or the bump that you just needed to overcome. What's next for you?
Time will tell what's next. I've got a big project I'm working on. So the big project, we talked about cars. Big project is restoring this house, 100-year-old house in Hollywood. So what's next is the same as what came before. doing things I enjoy doing. I don't want to stop doing things I enjoy doing because I just won't do them. I got to keep moving. My last name's Walker. I average 12,000 steps a day, every day. It's not that easy to do. So I got to find things that keep me motivated. I don't necessarily know big picture what is next. I do know I'm going through a transition. And the transition is, with this building, I'll have owned it 25 years. But everything that I talked about no longer happens in this building. Like, I'm not running my clothing business out of it. I'm not living in it. I had this very lucrative film location business, which enabled me to do a lot of things, which for various reasons, but the majority of them are the gentrification of the neighborhood. Everything that's great about it has actually affected my day job, which pays the bills. All the fun stuff, this is a hobby. What paid the bills was renting the building to production companies for filming. And at our peak, we filmed over 150 days a year. So I'm having to adapt to this new environment where I actually have no income coming in, but I've got assets, right? And one of them, I'm thinking, well, this building, how much longer am I going to be in it? So part of my brain is trying to think escape plan on opportunity back to timing. When's this building going to be worth 20 times what I paid for it? When I can sort of cash out, downsize, lose these things that are not quite as important to me. And then what does life look like then? I'm looking at cheap old houses all over the country and, cheap old chateaus in France thinking, wow, why don't I get one of those? That would be a fun project, right? So you don't really know, but I'm reevaluating this big asset that we're sat in that's right in the middle of everything that's hip, that is underutilized. It's not generating the income that it once did. There's no one here. It's car storage for me. Yes, I love coming here every day because it's an inspiring place. The building is inspired. There's good bones in this building. I'm about good bones and vibe, but I'm also about figuring this could be the golden retirement if I time it right, where I never have to worry about anything else.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. We're actually sitting here in downtown LA, in your garage, and I'm looking at probably about eight or nine Porsche. You've got another couple of areas around here in the same building. I don't know how many's next door.
There's a few. You got to open your eyes.
A few, yeah.
How many do you see?
I was going to say, I came down here, luckily, when we met, which was earlier this year, thanks to a mutual friend of ours, Justin Bell. And I bought JB, yeah. And I bought George down here. And at the time, he was into apparel, and he was all kind of like, I know about Sirius. I know about the Nike collab. And then he came out of here after seeing all of your Porsche. And now, thankfully, he's a technician in a Porsche dealership.
I mean, that's awesome. That's awesome that he's doing something that he loved.
It's incredible.
That he found something that he loves to do.
Yeah.
At an early stage in life, as opposed to finding at a later stage in life and then saying, oh, I wished I'd found that before, right?
Yeah, that's never kind of cool.
No. So if he's doing what he's loving at, 17, 18?
He's 18 now, yeah.
That's great. That really is.
It's pretty cool.
That's the key, is to do what you love. But people don't always know what it is they love doing.
Well, you've done a lot of different things. So whatever you get into the future, I want to say thank you very much for taking the time to do the podcast. And good luck with everything, pal.
Appreciate it, mate. Rock and roll. Cheers.
Well, that was another episode of the Art of Making Things Happen podcast with me, your host, Steve Sims. If you like it, you know the scoop. Subscribe, tell your friends, share it around. Let them get benefit from this juice. And of course, if you want to change the room you're in, join Sims Distillery. Jump over to stevedsims.com/Sims Distillery, or you can find a link directly from that website. That's the room where creative disruptors get together to actually help each other become better. If you've got standards or you want higher standards, join the right room. See you next time.